Welcome, everybody, to this new podcast, the Build Community Through Love podcast, BCTL podcast. I am the host, Dr. Joe Daniels. I'm here to provide a podcast where we highlight and interview people who are prominent in the community, looking to build, looking to empower, looking to inspire. And so we're bringing people in, we're bringing different guests in who are doing work in that area to empower and build community. Things like economic development and empowerment, things like community development and community empowerment, as well as looking at leadership development. We know in the time right now, leadership is crucial, is very important. And so that's what this podcast is. And we're just looking to have great people on to highlight what they're doing and see how we can continue to inspire our audience to build community through love. I am grateful to have for my very first guest on my very first episode, my father, Reverend Dr. Joseph W. Daniels Jr. He is doing great work as a pastor in the Baltimore, Washington region, as well as doing work all across this country, all across the world on multiple continents. And so I'm happy to have him here. He is going to introduce himself, what he's doing, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. And please enjoy this great father-son interaction as we get going. So, Dad, go ahead and take it away. Who are you? What are you doing? And let's get going.
Well, son, it's good to be with you this afternoon. I am truly honored and humbled to be with you on this podcast. Excited about the work that you are doing, the transformative work you're doing, and I'm glad to be a part of it and to share it with you. I am someone who has pastored a congregation for 28 years, it'll be 28 years in July, and have come at the whole aspect of pastoring a congregation from the standpoint of how can we make communities whole? How can we make conditions within communities where people can experience individual wholeness, family wholeness, community wholeness, and the like. So it's been a joy to serve the Lord and serve the congregation and serve the people. And I'm just excited to be here today.
Fantastic. So first question, when you hear the word community, what do you think of? Or even how do you define the word community?
Well, I like to just break it down by the two major words that are in that word community. So to me, a healthy community is a common unity. It's a common unity where there is common union, where those who live in the community are together, working together, and where each component of the community is trying to make the other better. I start there. And so what are the commonalities we have? What are the diversities we have? But what are the diversities we have that can be united, that can come together? That's where I begin by defining community. I then go to a more sophisticated definition because I believe each community, every community, whether you're in a rural area, suburban area, urban area, or ex-urban area, every community is made up of three sectors, and that's the private sector, the government sector, and the public sector. Understanding those sectors and having those sectors work together determines whether a community is healthy or not.
And so if you had to look at the health of it, what makes up a healthy community?
Well, a healthy community simply exists when the private sector and the government sector and the public sector are working together in tandem in a community, and each of those sectors in that community is strong. At any point, if one or more of those sectors is weak in a community, that community begins to suffer. So private sector, we know, brings the money into a community. They bring the jobs into a community. The government sector legislates community, but they also set up laws and circumstances for the private sector to be able to make money. And of course, the public sector, John, Jane, Q Public, is essential because we spend money, we live in community and the like. Where you have a community that has all of those sectors strong, you have a strong community. But if you've got bad government, or if you have a public sector that's suffering, or if a major corporation leaves a community, then you really have problems.
Interesting. So let's talk about your background. How did you get to where you are now as a pastor, and how has your different experiences in your background shaped you to actually begin a profession, a call, and into pastoring and into building community?
Well, as you know, I come from two parents who were very justice minded.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a civil rights kid. I was born in 1960, and so I grew up literally in the midst of the civil rights movement. Um, my father was your grandfather, obviously. He was engaged heavily in civil rights and in equal employment opportunity. He worked his last job, he was the director of equal employment opportunity for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, which at that time was the last bastion of white racism. And he was brought in to try to diversify the Federal Reserve, which he did in a tremendous way at great price. But he did. My mother was a school teacher, was a school teacher, is now a retired pastor herself. But she was the first Black business education teacher in the city of Pittsburgh. So I come out of two people who pioneered, two people who tried to change community and change realities for people, particularly around employment and around other areas. So that blood of developing community and developing fairness and justice for all people is in me.
Mm-hmm.
In my call to ministry, and daddy's side, your grandfather's side of the family was very much involved in church. Grandma's side, my mom's side, her younger sisters and her were involved in church as well. Their churches were very community oriented, community based. And growing up, it was all about how could you help somebody else be better? How could you make an environment, create an environment, be a part of an environment that blessed everybody? I come out of that. And so when I entered into the church, when I answered my call to ministry, God's call on my life to ordain ministry and became a pastor, it came out of that justice mindset. It came out of that fairness and equity mindset. It came out of that community building mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where it emerged. If I would go on, I'd say what further helped to shape it was I got heavily into community organizing. I'd started going to a lot of community organizing training through the Industrial Areas Foundation, the IAF, based out of Chicago. I did a lot of Communities of Shalom training, which was a training component in the United Methodist Church. And I learned a lot from both of those components. The Communities of Shalom training in the United Methodist Church was more immediate local neighborhood based, which was great. The IF training was more of a citywide reality. And so I got a chance to mesh the two and to take principles from the two and apply them to my context. And that's really the foundation of community development training that I come from.
So because when I think about pastorship, I mean, of course you're looking at different things, but like, I think it's interesting when people say, yeah, I want to pursue a career as a pastor, right? Because when you think about the church and you think about the organization of the church, you think more about, how are we really looking to build community in all the facets, right? Because you talked about the three levels of community. And so how does church align itself in a community so that it's now, seeking to be involved in the business aspect and the public aspect, right? And so how this has all shaped your understanding when you're going through these different trainings, when you're going through these different organizations, as you're beginning to form these relationships, because now you're actually building relationships with people who are on the ground, who actually understand the work that's being put forward. They understand the cries of people. They understand how heart is breaking, how people are losing hope day in and day out. And that's beginning to now shape your view and your vantage point on how church has to be at the crossroads of community building. So can you speak on that, on how that has influenced the call and the vision that you have been able to set forth for Emory Fellowship?
Well, I've always viewed from going to Bible study and then in the seminary and coming out of seminary, when I look at the biblical base of church and community, the church or the temple was always at the center of community life. It was that way in the Old Testament. As the church was formed in the New Testament, it became that way as well. And so for me, the church has always been the catalyst or the centerpiece of community life. And even if you look at the church today, even with the church's struggles, I'm talking about the church with the big C,
Mm-hmm.
even with the church's struggles, if you go into communities, the one thing that is the last thing to change within any community usually is the school or a church. And public education obviously is taking a huge hit now, and you have more charter schools and private schools and the like. But the one entity within a community that tends to be there by people, and if not by people, just the building itself,
Mm-hmm.
is the church. And so historically, the church has been the centerpiece of community life. If that's the case, then for me, the church has to be engaged in every one of the sectors that I mentioned.
Mm.
Obviously, the church is a part of the public sector. It's one of the organizations where people gather. But the reality of it is that when a church engages the power of God through Jesus Christ in all of the sectors that I mentioned, it can then help shape its reality. What tends to happen is that private sector folks and government sector folks, they get together and they organize very well, and they make decisions and determinations about neighborhoods, about communities, about cities, about regions, and they make those decisions. And oftentimes, representation from the church, whether it be pastors or even strong lay people from churches or synagogues or mosques or other religious institutions, they are often left out of the decision-making process. And so my whole focus has been, if in fact God has called the church to be the centerpiece or the catalyst of community life, then the church needs to be at the boardroom tables. The church needs to form relationships with wealthy business men and women. The church needs to be engaged with mayors of cities. The church needs to be involved in city council meetings. The church needs to be present in community meetings. The church needs to be engaged in any and every activity, at least have knowledge of it, but to help shape it in a way that helps people live life, or have life, as Jesus said, and have it more abundantly. So I've done a lot of work with one-on-one relational meetings, encouraging members to develop one-on-one relationships. It's through those relationships that you then build coalition, you build organization, and you essentially build power. You build the ability for people to act for their own well-being. And when you have a strong public sector like that then engages government and engages private industry, then it can be a win for the public sector, and it can be a win for the government and private sectors as well.
So then where are we lost? Like where are we as a community with the big C? Where are we lost? Like is the broken link in the chain the fact that we have lost the idea and the understanding of how to build relationships through one-on-one interaction? Is that where we're lost, or where do you think we kind of missed the target these last few decades?
I think we're lost on a number of fronts. I think the church itself, church with a big C, I believe has been lost in many ways, because we've gotten away from the very things that formed us. When you look at that first church that was formed in Acts chapter 2, you had people sacrificing that others could have. You had people giving where there was a need. You had people who were constantly building relationships, meeting together, having one-on-ones together. And they were constantly concerned about the well-being of the whole, okay? And that has broken down with us, becoming more and more a capitalistic society, where greed has often taken place, and the opportunity to capitalize on others. That's the very system that we have in America is built off of. But in so doing, I believe our greed has gotten so great that you have this continued gap between the haves and the have-nots that widens and widens and widens. And the middle class almost doesn't exist anymore. Either you got it or you don't have it. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's very real today. And so I think we've gotten away from a church point of view, we've gotten away from the biblical underpinnings of community, and even just from culture and how culture has woven itself through various communities, despite our different ethnicities. There's been a foundational reality of how do we hold each other together. I think more and more that we've gotten away from that. People are looking out for themselves. People are capitalizing on themselves more and more. And then we've got policies and procedures in place that feed that. And when we stop looking out for the well-being of others, which at its foundation is the definition of love, when we stop practicing justice, which is the absence of oppression and the presence of peace, when we stop making sure that those who are poor have and those who are rich share, we're heading to doom. We're creating doom.
Interesting. And so in 2019, a big thing happened in Washington, D.C. and Northwest D.C.
Yeah, it did.
And so a multi-million-dollar building connected to the church was opened, giving 250 plus people the ability to have affordable housing. So before we get into that space, because oftentimes we see church as a large building with four walls in a place
Right.
where typically you have signs that say, private parking, no parking, and so like from Monday through Saturday, it's a place where no one is really allowed to really step foot unless there's a program going on. But somehow, some way, there's a church now in Washington, D.C., where people lay their heads on Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, all the way through the week. They're able to wake up. They're able to be able to call someplace home at a cost that's not going to completely deplete them or force them to move into another area. So take me back 20 years prior to that, because you've been at the same church for now for close to 28 years now. So take me back to the vision and the call, and even leading up to the vision and the call. Take me to the place and to the space that you were in mentally, emotionally, spiritually, when you took your first steps up the stairway to enter your first service at Emory United Methodist Church.
Well, I was sent to a church that was dying. There were probably around 50 people in my first worship experience at Emory. But the realities of what I found when I got there were startling. Grass hadn't been cut in 6 years. The church was surrounded by empty alcohol bottles and beer cans that were literally dug into the ground, let you know how long they'd been there. Broken glass, used condoms, used syringes, the smell of urine all in the front steps. The evidence, as I said, particularly in our church stairwells, of prostitution and just disenfranchisement. And that was on the hill where we sat. If you came down the steps, then that part of Georgia Avenue where we were at that time was part of a major heroin distribution ring. So you had dealing on the corner, you had drug abuse on the corner, you had vagrants on the corner, you had people sleeping on the stairwells on the steps of the church in the stairwells. We were a picture of degradation, and that's what I was. That's what God sent me to start pastoring. And so, what I knew at that time as a 32-year-old pastor who was green. I had a couple of years experience as an assistant pastor, but all I knew at that time was to preach and teach Bible study and to engage people in community, and that's what I sought to do. So I preached every Sunday like it was my last Sunday. I started Bible study. I began to meet people in the neighborhood which I was familiar with somewhat because your grandfather and grandmother, my parents, did their shopping along Georgia Avenue. Dad bought his wine on Georgia Avenue. Dad got his shoes repaired on Georgia Avenue. Mom went shopping on Georgia Avenue. So I was familiar with it. Dad used to take me to Verner's Barbershop, a block from church. Little did I know I'd be at Emory Church serving, but we'd go to Verner's. And so I went down to the barbershop where I used to get my hair cut, and went in, and I thought I recognized one of the barbers and started going to him to cut my head. Lo and behold, he was president of the Alcoholics Anonymous chapter in the neighborhood. They were looking for a place to stay, a place to have their meetings. They came to Emory. And then I used to get my clothes cleaned at the cleaners across the street. And one day was waiting to get my shirts cleaned, and I turned around and looked across the street, and God just started showing vision. God started speaking vision about how the church was going to be at the root, at the center of redeveloping that whole area of Georgia Avenue. And I began coming back and sharing with the congregation what I was seeing, what I was hearing. I began preaching about it, teaching about it. People in the congregation began teaching and talking about what they were seeing. We began talking and doing one-on-one interviews in the neighborhood, and all of that kind of meshed together. Because I'm one who believes that when the leader's purpose and the congregation's passion and the community's need, or the community's cry, when all of those things kind of come together, right in that sweet spot where the three meet, is where God speaks vision, and that's what happened with us. And what vision we kept hearing was people needed an affordable place to stay, because at that time, as years went on, the cost of living in the District of Columbia was starting to rise, and it was starting even to come to the neighborhood where we were, which if you look around our church is very diverse in its economic landscape. You can go a block and be in poor neighborhoods, but you can go another block and be in middle class, and another few blocks and be in some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in DC, all within kind of a mile radius, I should say. But we kept hearing affordable housing. The people were being priced out of the neighborhood. Seniors were being priced out. Seniors could not afford to pay property taxes in the neighborhood that they had lived all their lives in. Other folks were saying, I need a affordable place to live. And so our task was, in a city that had become the number one gentrifying city in America, with some of the highest housing costs, was how do we use our property? How do we use our land to build housing and to create housing for people who are literally being priced out of the city? And that's what we sought to do.
And how hard was that, to be able to see that what a lot of people will deem as, not essential or not an asset? How are you able to turn inward and see that you all had everything that you needed right there under your feet, and you look to say, we are going to be the community, or we are going to be the church, and we have the asset that can now change lives in this city? How hard was that? Because oftentimes, we see outward, we see what we can control, see what we have in our bank account, and we often get either overwhelmed, or we quickly just have a poverty mindset to say, well, we can't do this because we lack X, Y, and Z. How hard was that to really kind of see and hear and feel the vision and be able to articulate that to people, even sometimes, for me, who constantly have a impoverished mindset, or a mindset of lack, as opposed to a mindset of abundance?
Vision is interesting, and you have to preach and teach and live vision as a leader, because where there is no vision, people perish. Mm-hmm. And so it is tough, but you've got to constantly live out vision in your own witness, and the more people you can bring along to that, it begins to create a climate and a movement that, you know what, this is possible. I'm one who believes that when God gives a vision, God also makes provision. And there was a time at the beginning of all this where getting people within the congregation to see what God was up to and what God wanted was one of the biggest challenges. I remember having people outside of the quote unquote church, outside of our church, in community, who, when we began speaking vision to them, they began to see it before folks in the church did. And that oftentimes happened. That's not a slap at the church or a slap at anybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's just oftentimes, you know, it's like being in family. Oftentimes when someone announces in family that I'm going to do this, it's the family members are like, yeah. Cause, you know,
okay.
Yeah. Okay. Right. You know,
you're so process to see like what somebody was like.
Right.
You
Right.
never do that because
There's
you
like,
have never shown past that you could ever do that. So
right.
go ahead,
Right.
kill that noise. Go ahead, kill that
Right.
noise.
Right. Like, yeah. Right.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
it's like, you know, it's like, you know, in the neighborhood I grew up in, you know, I announced one day as a 13-year-old that I was going to play college basketball in the Atlantic Coast Conference. And you know, my friends were rolling around the ground like, yeah, that'll never happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I saw myself years later playing ball at the University of Maryland, playing ball at Wake Forest, playing ball against Georgetown. You know, it's like, you know, when God shows you something, if you have the tenacity to chase after it in the face of obstacles that are going to constantly come, then you see that you're going to be able to overcome. So you ask, how hard is it? It's hard because there are always, you know, it's God's vision when you cast it and announce it, and then all of a sudden you have challenges against it.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what happened with us. You know, where are you going to get the money? Okay. I mean, we built a $58 million project with a 400 member church. We don't have $58 million, but what we did was to take the assets that we had. Okay. And that's a big thing. I oftentimes like to tell people, stop sitting on your assets. Okay. Your assets are huge. We've got people assets and we've got physical assets, and even if it's not much, we have financial assets. And so we began to simply use our assets. We had a church and property that had been paid for. So we had no mortgage. And as property values in our neighborhood and in our city were going up, so was the value of our property. So we decided to leverage our property, number one. Number two, when we cast this vision to the city, we also of course we had cast it to the congregation, but I said to the congregation, we can't go ask the city to be a part of this if we're not willing to put money on the table ourselves, which was tough for us because we were a working class congregation.
So hold on real quick. Cause like we're talking about this because we know it, right? So we know exactly what happened. And
right.
So real quick to catch all the listeners and all those who's watching, this vision happened when and at what year?
So, you know, I was standing in that cleaners I was just telling you about in 1994. Okay. We didn't actively start working on this vision because we had to do a lot of congregational development in the process of all this, and we had to build relationships and all that. It was 2005, 2006 when we actually began thinking about the development process. And then it was 2008 when we actually hired a developer. And then we had to go through 4 mayoral changes. 4, which is constantly building new relationships.
And that's huge because you said in 1994 at the cleaners, you observed this, and in this vision that you were seeing, which I would say is a spiritual vision, you are with your physical eyes seeing death all around you. You're seeing failing businesses. You're seeing buildings that are crumbling down. You see people constantly walking around homeless, helpless, in need, but have nowhere to go to pursue that.
Yeah,
and so all in while this vision is now brewing in your spirit, brewing in your soul. So like maybe 1 or 2 people are beginning to now catch on to the vision as well and beginning to speak the same language as you are. You're now having to cultivate relationships with people. You're not having to like bring a church who also has a dying mentality, a hopeless mentality and mindset, and try to steer them in a direction to see that God has all opportunities and can do all things as long as you trust him and walk through faith. And
Right.
so from 94 up into the early 2000s, you're now beginning to do congregational development to allow them to see that now we are the cog in the building of this community in the three phases and three segments of community. We are that cog. And so now as you're able to communicate, okay, we are going to use our asset to now build affordable housing in the Washington, D.C. market. And that's what we're going to do. And so you said before you could do anything, you had to prove that the church was going to be the spearhead of this movement, of this vision, of this project. And so walk me through that process, and then walk me through how you were able to actually utilize different entities and things like that to actually build this vision out.
So I had to learn, okay? I had to keep learning. And a lot of times we come out of school and we think, okay, our education is over. But I had to keep learning. And what I had to learn was community and economic development. And I had to learn community organizing. So, I had my degree, but I feel like the first 7 years of pastoring, when I got to year 7, I felt like I had reached a point where I had given the people all I knew how to give. And so I literally started traveling the country, going to conferences to learn more about congregational development. At the same time, I got more involved, as I had said earlier, in community organizing and understand how to organize community, how sectors work, how to leverage power, how to build relationships, et cetera. So during that period, from seeing that vision in 1994 up to working that vision, big time come 2008, that's 14 years. I'm in training. I'm learning community engagement. I'm participating in community organizing through community organizing networks that we formed in DC, in particular with the Washington Interfaith Network. I'm going to meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, meeting board members of Fannie Mae Foundation, Fannie Mae Corporation. I'm sitting in mayor's offices. I'm meeting with the HUD chair at the time, Henry Cisneros. I was going to meetings at the White House. I led meetings with Hillary Clinton in the White House. I'm fighting Mayor Marion Barry, on leveraging resources to our community. So at one point Mayor Barry was an ally. Another point he was a foe, and then he was an ally again. So I'm learning public engagement, private engagement. I'm building leverage, and so this thing doesn't happen like this. It doesn't happen overnight, or you just can't show up and do it. You've got to learn how each sector works, and you've got to learn how the church can leverage each sector for the building of the kingdom of God. And they don't teach that in seminary. They don't teach that in seminary. I didn't learn that in seminary. More and more it's being taught now because others, myself, are beginning to teach this. But I became captivated by it because right as I was graduating from seminary, there was an organizer who came from the IAF, from the Industrial Areas Foundation, who began to teach community organizing. I was intrigued by it because I'm like, this is the kind of stuff my dad was involved in. This kind of stuff my mom was involved in. And so I got engaged in it. And I was willing to keep learning. I think the moment that we stop learning is the moment we die. And so I began to learn how the private sector operates, how the government sector operates, how the public sector operates, how they operate in tandem, how they don't operate in tandem, how deals get cut, how politics works, how politics works across sectors, the power of the local church, the power of nonprofits, all of that together. I just kind of wove, like a fabric, like a quilt. It's kind of brought it all together and tried to bring as many people from church together in it so that we could see it, understand it, and then make it happen. And then bring my own skin into the game. So, with the Beacon Center, with the $58 million, we brought our property and leveraged it. We raised, surprised us. We raised $1.4 million from a working class congregation, people who sacrificed, people who took on second jobs, people who did this to leverage this thing. And so we began to literally leverage and work with the different sectors who saw the vision, because the mayor recognized very clearly we have an affordable housing project in DC. She was a huge supporter of ours. Public sector, private sector, we have a major problem here. And so when they saw the church really trying to do something, they're like, whoa, because typically churches don't think like that. Churches don't operate like this. But when they saw that the church wanted to be a community partner, they're like, hey, let's make this happen. And so we leveraged monies from here, there, here. Next thing you know, we were able to build it by God's grace.
And so what is it doing right now?
So right now, from the time we opened last year, we've been at full occupancy. We built 99 units. We built 99 units of affordable rental housing that literally wrap around our church like a horseshoe.
Wow.
3-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units, 1-bedroom units.
Yep.
And studios. And 8 of the units are permanent supportive housing units. So they house people who are moving from homelessness to permanent residency. But the power of what we were able to do as a collective, because the government sector came together with the private sector and came together with the public sector and the church, what we were able to do is to leverage resource such to where we built luxury apartments, and those who live in the luxury apartments are people who make 60% of the average median income in the District of Columbia. And so the average median income in the District of Columbia today is $120,000 a year. The average median income for a family of 4, a white family of 4 in the District of Columbia, is $120,000 a year. The average median income for a Latino family of 4 in DC is $41,000 a year. The average median income for an African American family in DC is $38,000 a year. So you've got essentially an $80,000 a year wealth gap in the District of Columbia. Well, within that, son, the average 2-bedroom apartment in the District of Columbia is a little over $3,000 a month. The average the average 2-bedroom rent, two-bedroom apartment rent in DC is about $3,200 a month. Okay, the highest rent in our building for a 3-bedroom luxury apartment, marble countertops with some of the prettiest views in DC, because we sit up on the highest shelf in DC. The highest rent is $1,500 a month.
Wow.
So we've essentially, but you have to make, as a family of 4, you cannot make more than about $70,000 a year. If you earn $70,000 a year or less, then you can live there. What this does is it provides affordable housing for people who make up the infrastructure of the District of Columbia.
Interesting.
Who without the infrastructure of the District of Columbia, your industries cannot exist. So,
it's a broken ecosystem.
It's a broken ecosystem. So what we sought to do was to rebuild the ecosystem as best as we could, so that hotel workers, hospital employees who are not, doctors and nurses or specialists who are making great salaries, but more, union employees, security guards, low-end police officers, low-end firefighters, school teachers,
bus drivers,
drivers,
transit workers,
cab drivers,
Uber
drivers,
senior citizens,
across the gamut. Okay. who make up the infrastructure of a city or the infrastructure of a town, but who can't afford to live there because they ain't making money to pay $3,000 a month on rent.
Right.
We provided housing for people in these categories, and because over that 14-year span I was telling you about, from 94 to 2008, we began to make relationships with people on the street who were homeless. And we began to hear their stories about how they needed housing. And in our feeding them through food pantries, through opening our church doors and feeding people who are homeless, through housing people who are homeless in our church, through starting a transitional housing ministry. These are the kinds of things that were going on over that period of time. We began to learn what the need was and hear what the need was and respond to it. So the first person we ministered to on the corner back in 1995, who was a gentleman who was homeless, he's now a resident of the Beacon Center. Okay, and there are other persons who were homeless that we worked with who are now residents. And so when you have this kind of community interaction, and as you put it, when the ecosystem is working, then everybody gets blessed.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And so as we move on to our last little segment here, being very excited about the work that's going on right now in DC, and as everything continues to go, even through this whole COVID-19 experience, I would like to just ask you, who is the person or the group of people who influence you and keep you going, and why do you tend to lean on those people?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I lean on the memory of my parents. That's first and foremost, because I know their fight, and I know what they came through, and I lean on the memory of my grandparents and my great grandparents, and I pay very close attention to the legacy that they have passed down, and the legacy that is our responsibility to carry on. And so that memory, of course, grandma, your grandmother, my grandmother is still alive. Most of my aunts and uncles and grandparents have passed on, but their legacy was so rich that I carry it in me, and it fuels me. Our Uncle Robert, who you know so well, Robert Brown, and his prominence in the civil rights movement inspires me. His prominence to help people in all kinds of situations and to fight for justice, that inspires me. My congregation inspires me. The people there who are constantly giving, constantly sacrificing, constantly seeking to see God's kingdom inspires me. Fellow colleagues of mine in the city who are engaged in community organizing, people like Lionel Edmonds, Hazel Broadnax, who you know so well from our congregation. I could go on and on. People like that who've been in the struggle, John Moore, other people like that who've been in the struggle and have worked to see these things come to pass. They influence me, and you influence me. Mommy influences me, your mom, my wife, Joya, your sister, my daughter, family. You all inspire me because you've taken the mantle and you have defied odds and have conquered odds and are achieving not just for yourselves, but you too, both of you, all of you are looking at how do we help those who are struggling, those who Howard Thurman says are the disinherited. How do we lift them up in the midst of seeking to thrive and be the best we can in what we do. So that's just, I mean, I could go on and on, but I've learned and I continue to learn and be inspired by those who I've mentioned and even more that time just doesn't allow me to name.
Wonderful. Okay, last thing. a lot of people choose and seek to live a life of purpose, a life of passion. That's what people are always seeking, purpose and passion. And so, in your experience, as you as a pastor, as you work in the community, as you work as a superintendent within the United Methodist Church in the Baltimore Washington Conference, have you been able to experience the intersection of purpose, passion, and paycheck? And does that even exist?
I have always been somebody who always focuses and starts with call, and call, C-A-L-L. Call emerges from many different words of many different languages, but for this purpose, I used the Latin word vocare, which means call. It's where we get vocation from. Okay. To me, it's critical that one taps into what is God calling me to do, and so for me, when I'm able to tap into what is God calling me to do, I'm really talking about what does God want me to do. What is the will of God for my life, which gets then into what is your purpose for my life? And so if I want to discover that, yes, I'm a pastor, but I'm a man of faith. And so for me, faith plays a key role in that. If I'm seeking to discover the will of God for my life, God the Almighty, then I've got to get in touch with the Word of God, because one discovers the will of God through the Word of God. And so in my praying, in my meditating, God revealed to me Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah in the Old Testament, chapter 1, verses 4 through 10. And boom, there was the root of my call to pluck up and tear down, destroy, overthrow, build and plant. That's what I've done. I've broken down barriers and built bridges of hope for people. And when you go to that whole text, if I were to walk you through it, I can tell you all the different ways that God has moved within that, in that biblical text, that God spoke to me to reveal God's will for my life. And I'm still living that out. And so once that is addressed and once that is identified, which sometimes happens early in life, sometimes happens later in life, I began to really discover it after I got to Emory. Okay, when I was 32 years old, it started to crystallize. When that happens, suddenly God begins to take you on a journey, and everything that you did or everything that you used up to that point and beyond, God uses it to guide you down a path. My testimony is to not only take care of you, which addresses your paycheck issue, but also to prosper you in ways where not only are you taken care of, but you can take care of others. And that's been my reality. So, I remember working in corporate America. I remember making a great salary working in hospital public affairs, getting ready to buy the big house. And then God was saying, no, that's not the direction I want you to go. And having to forfeit a great paying job and all of a sudden be on a minister's salary, which at that time, I went to Emory. My first salary at Emory was $14,000 a year, with a wife and with the two of you, you and Joya. Joya was 3 at the time. You were a year old. Okay, it's like, oh, I mean, mommy didn't have that good government job. I don't know where we would be. But to me, it's imperative for one to pursue one's calling, because not only then do you discover purpose in that, but you also begin to enjoy life. You begin to have joy. You're happy. You're excited and enthused about what you do. Every day becomes a new day. Every day is a different day, and suddenly, life becomes more and more worth living. And I'm just one who believes that when you chase after what it is that God wills for you to do, God will take care of everything else in the process.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, there you have it, folks. That is the first episode of the BCTL podcast, Building Community Through Love. Dad, Reverend Joseph W. Daniels, I want to say thank you for contributing. Thank you for all the nuggets. Thank you for inspiring. Thank you for encouraging. Thank you for leading in an effort to build community in the greater Washington, D.C. area, throughout this country and abroad. The one thing that I got is that you must continue to learn. If you stop learning, that's the moment that you die and are no longer relevant to the community in which you're serving. And so the one thing that's also inspiring is you can be doing things to continue to build community even on your job. And so as working as a pastor, it's interesting how you were able to develop this understanding that I need to go out and go to conferences and learn and to continue to grow from a community and economic development standpoint. So at your job, in your cubicle, as you are an entrepreneur, as you're moving, you can do more things to continue to equip your tool belt with things to continue to go out and build community. So thank you. Join us next time on the Build Community Through Love podcast. Tell them we're building.